Sometimes we have no choice but to confront dangerous or uncomfortable circumstances head on. Esther faced such a challenge. Her adoptive parent, Mordecai, who was actually Esther's cousin, gave her this advice, quote, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" That's from the 4th chapter of Esther, verse 14. This real-life Cinderella story took place in Susa, which was the capital of the Persian Empire, in 479 BC. The setting was the king's lavish palace. King Xerxes threw a massive 6-month-long party to demonstrate his wealth and his power so that the people in his presence would come to have confidence in the king's ability to wage war against other nations. One evening after the king had consumed too much wine, he commanded his wife, the queen, Vashti, to be presented to the assembled male guests so that they could all admire the queen's beauty. She refused. The king was no doubt embarrassed. After all, he was trying to impress his guests about how he wielded power and how he had authority and the ability to successfully lead his nation into battle, but he was not even able to command the appearance of his wife, the queen. After consulting his advisors, the king issued several edicts in order to head off a potential national crisis that would occur if wives were to follow the example of Queen Vashti and defy the orders of their husband. We read this in the 1st chapter of the book of Esther, verses 10 through 19, and this is the part of the story where I try to resist editorial comment. Now, Queen Vashti, as a result, was banished from the kingdom, and a royal decree was issued declaring, quote, "Every man should be ruler over his own household." That's from the 22nd verse of Esther 1. And a nationwide search was conducted for a new queen. Now, Esther was a beautiful young woman who had been raised by her older cousin, Mordecai. They were among the Jews whose families had been driven out of Jerusalem more than 100 years earlier. Esther won favor from the king, who did not realize that she was of Jewish descent. While Esther was in the king's palace, Mordecai was pacing outside the palace gate. He observed a conspiracy in the making that would have caused the king to be assassinated. Mordecai passed that information on to Esther. In turn, she notified the king. Meanwhile, one of the king's advisors, a person named Haman, became offended that this Jew, Mordecai, refused to bow down in Haman's presence. Therefore, Haman convinced the king to issue an irreversible decree that all Jews in the Persian kingdom were to be killed on a certain day. In anticipation of that day, Haman had erected a tall pole from which he would impale Mordecai. That was his plan. When the king's death decree was issued, Mordecai got word to Esther and asked that she approach the king and beg for mercy, plead for him and for her people. We read that in Esther 4:8. Esther, however, knew that anyone who approached the king without an express invitation would be put to death. Faced with this dilemma of the king's decree to exterminate the Jews and the palace policy of killing anyone who approached the throne without an invitation, Esther found herself in an impossible situation. She faced death either way. That's when Mordecai provided his now famous advice, quote, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for a time such as this?" Esther responded by asking Mordecai to assemble the Jews for a time of fasting. Although it is not expressed, the clear implication in that passage is that the people were to gather together to fast and pray for God's intervention. Once 3 days of fasting and prayer were completed, Esther would then venture into the king's presence. Esther, knowing the risk, added, "If I perish, I perish. That's Esther 4, verse 18. After the Jews had gathered for 3 days of prayer and fasting, Esther coyly presented herself in the outer court where the king would likely see her. The king was pleased to see her, and he summoned Esther to approach the throne. The king magnanimously offered, "What is your request? It shall be given to you." Queen Esther was cautious. She said that her request was for the king and his advisor Haman to attend a banquet offered by the queen. The king readily accepted the invitation for himself and for Haman. Queen Esther hosted the banquet and then requested the king and Haman attend a second banquet. At the second banquet, the king repeated his request. "Queen Esther, tell me what you want. Grant me, tell me anything you want, and it will be granted." Here was Esther's response. "Grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people." This is in the 7th chapter of Esther, verse 3. When the king understood that the irretractable decree to kill the Jews included Queen Esther and Mordecai, who had uncovered this assassination plot against him, King Xerxes became distraught and angry. Haman, the man who had concocted this decree to kill the Jews, was put to death and was impaled on the very pole that Haman had erected for Mordecai. King Xerxes' decree to kill the Jews could not be retracted, so the king authorized a new decree. This decree allowed the Jews to assemble and defend themselves. We read that in Esther 8, verse 11. On the appointed day, the Jews assembled and successfully defended themselves. Although the king's decree allowed the Jews to take property from the enemies over whom they were victorious, the Jewish committee took no plunder from those whom they killed. A time of celebration was established for the Jews to commemorate their victory over their enemies. That celebration, known as Purim, is celebrated by the Jewish community to this very day. In the midst of overwhelming danger, God was present, protecting his chosen people when they called on their God. This theme is often repeated in Scripture, right up through the end times, the Battle of Armageddon that we read about in Revelation 16, verses 16 through 20. Esther provides much fodder for reflection. Consider, if you will, these 3 questions. Question number 1. When faced with the king's edict calling for the extermination of Jews, Esther instructed Mordecai to assemble the Jewish community for a time of prayer and fasting. Are there circumstances today that warrant a time for Christians to gather together in prayer and fasting? To what social crises have you responded, or should you respond with prayer and fasting? Question number 2. Mordecai suggested that Esther had been placed in the king's palace, quote, for a time such as this. God places each of us in certain places for his purposes. What purpose has God placed you in your current place and circumstance? Number 3, the Jewish holiday Purim was established to commemorate the reversal of fate for God's people. Esther had acted on her faith, rallied the people to fast and pray. Those actions led to God's miraculous protection. How should this example from Scripture affect our everyday living? The story of Esther reminds us that God never leaves or forsakes his people. When we seek God through prayer and fasting and obedience to his plan, he will hear us from heaven. He will help us through even the worst of life's circumstances. May we never be too distressed to turn to God for his direction and his empowerment.